This is Wednesday, November the 10th, 2010. I'm talking with Sam Coronado. This is Tomas Rivera Frausto. We're in Los Angeles, California at the Los Angeles Athletic Club Hotel. And Sam, maybe we can start out just reviewing a little bit of your chronology of your life, and I'll interrupt as we talk.
Okay. All right. Well, I was born in a little town outside of Dallas, and I was brought up. I grew up in Dallas, Texas, and spent some time going back and forth to my grandparents that lived in Ennis, Texas. There, they were, I guess, worked the fields, and while I was living with them, I got to experience that. Go out and work the cotton fields and get up early in the morning, and work was the most important thing, and that's what my grandparents really instilled in me. Work ethic, getting up early, doing a lot of work. Eventually, that was going to very hard work would pay off. On the other hand, my father really instilled education. He said that was a very important part of a person's life. So between both of them, I was constantly being influenced in one way or the other. Through my grandparents, I learned that working hard was honorable. Working in the fields was very natural. I would get up and see the sunrise. I would smell the earth, and that sort of had a very intoxicating feeling to me early on. So I learned what it was to work with your hands and feel the earth and walk early in the morning in these fields. Eventually, I moved back with my father in Dallas, and was reintroduced to, you might say, the city life that sort of influenced me in a different way.
Your siblings? Your brothers and sisters?
I have a brother and a sister, and then four half brothers and one half sister. And they were a lot younger than I am, or they're a lot younger than I am. And so I was the oldest of all of them. So I was going to high school, and in those days, back in the early 60s, there were a lot of this. They call them gangs now. In those days, it was just groups of people young guys that hung around, and I got involved with them, with the wrong crowd, you might say. And I had to didn't graduate, but had to leave high school early, join the Army, and I think that was a very important part, or else I think I might have not gone the way I have in terms of my art. But I joined the Army. And all throughout elementary school and high school, I did study art, did drawings, as most artists do early on. And there was something about art that kind of was always with me. My grandmother used to knit. My mother used to knit and crochet. My grandmother was a seamstress, did shirts, dresses for folks. And so I think I got that idea of working with my hands from her and my mother. Eventually, I got out of the service and started going to school. My father again was telling me that I should go to school, go into a junior college that had just opened up in Dallas. And so I started studying art. A friend of mine came by, an Army buddy came by and asked me what I was doing, what I was studying. I said, art. He said, Sam, you better start studying something that will make a living, because you're going to starve to death. So he had a point. I started taking some drafting classes, and I was really a natural for it. My artistic talent sort of helped the technical aspect of drafting, and I was hired by Texas Instruments as a technical illustrator. So from then on, I was working during the day as an illustrator and at night as a fine artist doing my work. And so since then, I've never had less than two jobs. Sometimes I've had more. all of them dealing with art one way or the other. To this day, I teach full time at a community college, and I direct a SERI project that deals with screen printing, and I also have a studio that actually does the printing for that project, as well as my own work.
Sam, let me ask, were there any individuals or particular people as you went through technical and high school or even elementary that you could signal out that pushed you or helped you develop your artistic inclinations?
I think in high school there was an art teacher, an advertising art teacher. That's what they called the course I was taking. His name was Mr. Kennedy, and he influenced me. He encouraged me to stay with that aspect of my, I guess, education, going into graphics. Um, when I was taking college courses at that community college, I had another instructor, Mr. Kirkpatrick, who actually got me the job at Texas Instruments as an illustrator because he saw that I had talent in that area. And so I think those two folks really helped. In terms of my family, I think mainly just watching my grandmother knit, my mother sew, and my grandmother sew as well, and I think work with their hands. I think it was very fascinating to me that they could, with a string of thread, they would knit these very ornamental designs, and then they would have them all over the house, all over the living room, on the couch, on the tables, which was very beautiful. And I'd watch my grandmother work with her hands and knit these beautiful knittings when I was young. I think that kind of stayed with me, the idea of creating art with your hands.
In terms of books or was there any, when do you remember looking at, say, oh, I want to be like that artist, this particular artist or that, just in terms of as you were, you know, going to school, was there
Oh, well,
particularly in advertising, or were you just
well, it
self-taught?
was hard for me in school because I was going back and forth from this little town, well, from Dallas, which was a large city in those days, to a small little town outside of Dallas, and I was going back and forth because of my parents' marital situation, and so I really didn't have that inclination to to read or look at I'm more a visual person, so I would watch movies, I would watch TV whenever I could, and I would get ideas. And between myself and my cousin, who was really one of the most influential persons, he was my age, but he had a talent. And when
What's
I
his
was
name?
his name is Fred Martinez. He became a priest, and during that time when he was studying to become a priest, he gave me a little set of paints that he'd had. Uh, and that sort of encouraged me to start painting in oils. And he became a priest later on. He left the priesthood and started counseling. But his influence in terms of how we would get together on weekends and we'd compare drawings. In some cases, we would build things with our hands and we would exchange ideas. I think he was pretty much instrumental in really focusing me in that artistic part of me that no one else would really encourage me. My father was just education. My grandparents worked hard. They felt the harder you worked, the more successful you would be. And
You mentioned, you know, like a lot of us, our first visual, at least for me, was like the calendars that, you know, the stores gave, and my mother used to save them, cut out at the year, so she would put them all in the kitchen, and there were many Mexican scenes,
mhm.
and, you know, like I wouldn't understand. I would say, well, what's that? And she would tell whatever she could about the stories. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about. You said your mother was, or your family. You had seamstresses. You had people that did crochet and work with their hands. And what other visual things that you remember? Were there any altars? Did anybody in
Oh
in
yeah.
your community? Can you
Oh
remember
yeah.
those, the yards, or what are the
Right.
elements that sort of like, that you remember about visual culture in that community?
All my grandparents, I mean, my grandparents, all my aunts, all of them, when I would visit them, they all visited them. They all had an altar of some sort, and of course, on these altars, it was very curious to me because I would, regardless of where I would go, and I would see these altars. Some would have lit candles, others would have flowers, and some would have a glass of water for the different saints. But uh, most of the time, they would always have that image of El Sagrado Corazon, and of course the Virgin Mary, and then John F. Kennedy. He was constantly in those altars, along with all my relatives that have passed away or folks that were, uh, every household had a different altar, but they all had similarities, and that always intrigued me. Very colorful, along with those calendars that you say, but for the most part, um, those altars were pretty significant.
What about music? Was it? I'm trying to get at. Was it at a time when it was bicultural? Was it more Mexican? The music you heard, the art around you, because obviously, I don't know. You haven't talked. I don't know what the ethnic makeup of the places where you were growing up with
Mm.
was like.
Well, they were definitely Mexican. A lot of my grandmother was born in Texas and died in Texas in the same little community. She never learned to speak English. My aunts, my mother's sisters, and my mother grew up in a very segregated situation where they would try to go to school, but because of the crops and because of the working out in the fields and because of the prejudice that existed there, they had a hard time going to school. But they did try. On my father's side, on the other hand, he tried to get his. I think he had like a sixth grade education and then dropped out. But they they tried, but the environment for Mexican American or Mexicano in those days was not suited for them at that point.
What about in school? What I'm getting at is you seem to have a home life that was mainly Mexican culture and Spanish,
Hmm.
and then the school that was in English.
Right.
And how did you negotiate those two worlds?
Well, at home I was Mexican, and at school I was an American, and so I would go home to frijoles and tortillas, and all the staples that we would have during the day. At school we would have our sandwiches. Uh, there were two different worlds, and I was able to cross over. I felt I was able to cross over and live in both of them adequately. But as I grew older, I found myself that I sometimes had to make sacrifices with my cultura in order to exist in an all white situation, like as an illustrator, perhaps, where I was involved with rows and rows of illustrators. Most of them were white. There weren't any blacks in those days, and I probably was one of the few, if not the only, Mexican American in that group. We used to have these large bays of illustrators that would just sit there and draw technical drawings. So eventually I sort of assimilated. Uh, I felt that there was something missing when I was doing that, and it wasn't until I came to school here at the University of Texas that I felt a purpose for what I was doing, for what I was studying, and so it all sort of started coming together. And I think one of the first folks that really kind of set me in that direction was a poet by the name of Alurista. And I read a couple of the books that he was required in his Chicano Studies class, and all of a sudden I saw a purpose for what I was doing. Now, obviously, I was a late starter. I mean, I had been in the Army early on when I was young, but by the time I finished school. It took me 8 years to finish a 4-year diploma.
This was what years?
This I started in about '69, and I think I graduated from UT in about '75, an undergrad. And so that was an area that I felt was that I had assimilated to that point. But when I started reading some of the books that he, Bless Me Ultima, was one of them, other books that he had suggested, I started seeing some of the things that I had overlooked or perhaps that I had turned my back on. And so a whole new world opened up. And that's when I started painting and dealing more with the cultura. That's when I became a little bit more aware of the Chicano movement and what it was to be a Chicano, and in particular a Chicano artist. I wasn't aware that it was that difficult. I thought an artist was an artist, so all I had to do was, if I finished school, I would go out and I would paint, and the whole world would love my work. But it wasn't that way. It's been a long, hard struggle. Even after 30, 40 years, it's still not easy. As I mentioned before, when we were talking earlier, when I was in Houston back in the middle '70s, it was hard to get exhibits in established galleries or art centers. So as Chicanos, we had to create our own venues, either through restaurants, perhaps community centers in the barrio. We had to come up with ways to exhibit our work. And in those days, people would come out to see, especially Latinos in general, would come out to see because they were craving something different, something that would speak to them about the culture. And so I learned early on that there was an audience for our work, but it wasn't quite the audience I expected. So I learned a lot from that, and I realized that in time things would change, and they have.
I want to go back to that period, Rurista period. He was just in San Antonio 2 weeks ago. He's got a new book out, Runa Tuna.
Yeah.
It's a new, and it's sort of like a renaissance for him too.
Right.
After 28 years, he's coming back, and at a different level. Were you doing oils? Were you doing mainly graphics? We're getting now into the graphic part.
Yeah. Well, early on, I started with oils. I mentioned my cousin Fred.
Yeah.
He and I explored a lot of different things. One of the things that we explored together was art. So one of the first things that he turned me on to was the paint by number sets, that you could buy in those days. Of course, working on the fields, they must have cost like $1, and $1 in those days was a lot of money. That was, I would make $7.50 working for a week out in the field. Spending $1 on a oil painting set was quite a bit. But we would do it, and then we would get together. And I remember the first time he told me, "Look, you got to do this. You got to try this. It's real simple. I know you can do it." So I went out and bought one the first time. I opened up that little. They used to be in little containers, and you'd peel the top off. And the first time I smelled that, it was like, I don't know, it was like heroin, I guess. It just took over. And so I was addicted to that. And so I really liked the feel, the smell, the whole idea. And my first painting, we compared. And of course, he was always a little bit better than I was in terms of painting. So I really looked up to him, and we continued. But that was the very first time that I had experienced that sense of oil painting, or that took over. And from that point on, I was always trying to work with oils, and I did experiment with acrylics early on, maybe in the late '60s, early '70s, but the acrylics weren't quite as saturated in color as the oils were. I would do a lot of paintings in oils, and throughout school I would also work in oils, a lot of photography, but generally painting. My graphics work was very flat, very spatial, a lot of line work. Sometimes that influenced how I saw artwork. And so I really had to work hard to break myself from those confines that I was living during the day, where everything had to be very precise, everything had to be very linear, and I had to deal with a lot of space, you might say, two-dimensional space. My goal was to develop this sense in oils of this three-dimensional quality, uh, creating this volume on a two-dimensional.
So that you were working and doing draftsman kind of work,
Mhm.
and then you were also, was it art school? Were you in the art department at
And right, I was fortunate that when I did, because I had that did illustration for Texas Instruments when I came to UT. I left that job in Dallas, came to UT here in Austin, and I was looking for a job, and I saw in the Daily Texan an advertisement for an illustrator or a draftsman. I can do that. That's just. So I went and interviewed with the professor, and the first time I sat with him, he knew I was the one to. So that's how I made a living and how I sustained myself besides the GI Bill. And by then I was married and I had a daughter, and so I had to provide for them and I had to provide for school. So it was kind of tough for me to go to school and try to manage a family at the same time. But it was all part of this learning experience, part of this opening up. Maybe I went about it in the wrong way. I mean, maybe I just fell in by luck into certain situations that kind of occurred through my life. But I've noticed that if I try to push something, if I try to make my work more than what it really is, or if I try to do something more than what I think it should be, or more than it's supposed to be, they'll put it that way, it never works out. But if I let it just happen, and if a door opens and if I walk through that door, generally it was open for a reason and I find there's a purpose for it. So that goes back to how I've experienced art as well. Through that experimentation process, through learning about two-dimensional work, through learning about technical aspects of drawing, I've also enhanced, you might say, what I've done in my work. I've always been more spatially oriented, more planes are involved rather than a diagonal perspective, you might say. I look at things more in terms of plane, and part of that has to come through this illustration.
Were you taking art classes aside, theory or drawing or painting, or was that mainly your self-taught in that area?
No, I came when I was going to UT. I was taking classes in studio art,
And do you
and I was
remember,
doing my.
was there anyone whose work you liked, or and
Oh,
whether
in
it was
those days, I think mainly the Mexican muralists were when I had to study, make research or do research in terms of technique, or perhaps in terms of style. I would always tend to go and research the Mexican murals, Diego Rivera, Corsiqueros, Orozco. Some of the more contemporary American Indians, like Fritz Scholder, uh, John Nieto, perhaps. Some of those folks, R.C. Gorham, would influence me. Maybe a few American painters early on, George Bellows, Robert Enright, these kind of folks. Um, but generally, I would tend to go back towards the Mexican influence, the
was
muralists.
there one in particular? I mean, of all of them, did Orozco speak more to you than Siqueiros, or did they
Probably Diego
Rivera?
Rivera, because he was probably the most well known. But among all the Latin American artists that I studied, Francisco de Cislo, I think, is one that I also really appreciated. And,
His colors.
colors, his flat, two-dimensional approach. Of course, he's very simplistic approach. Of course, it's evolved since then. But I really took note of his color and use of color and how vibrant the use of his palette was. Diego Rivera had this massive figurative approach to his work that was very stylized but very heavy, and so I liked that, and so I took a little bit of that and a little bit from all of them, and I tried to. Obviously, you cannot do the same thing they're doing, but it influences you, and you do what you see that influences in your own way, and that's what I did.
What about like the graphics? Was the Taller de Gráfica Popular? Did you learn about all that, or was that later? Or
That was I studied a little bit of about them. Because I went to school at UT, it was very limited in terms of Latin American influence. Although the Michener collection was very heavy on Latin American artists, and so I did learn a lot by just going to the museum and studying them. But no, most of the instructors there at UT, and probably in that era, unless you were fortunate enough to find a Latino instructor or someone that was sensitive to the culture, you pretty much were limited to American artists and European
what
artists.
about that? You said you mentioned, Schroeder and R.C. Gorman and were there any Mexicans, Amado Peña, other people? What was the crowd like
Well,
that you were beginning to?
Well, in those when I first started off, like I said, I was a late bloomer, and by then Amado Peña, Cesar Martinez, Carmen Lomas Garza, and a few of those folks had already come out of, I think it was Texas A&I,
Okay.
and they were making their names. The first time that I ever saw the first Chicano artist that was exhibit that was truly termed as a Chicano art exhibit was in Austin, and it was artwork by Amado Peña and Carmen Lomas Garza, Cesar Martinez, and these folks from that era. And so I was also influenced by them. All of a sudden I started seeing that there is a possibility for what I was doing in school. There is a place for it.
And what kind of subject matter were you dealing with at that time?
Well, most of it has always been figurative, right? And so most of these artists were also figurative for the most part. Some of them experimented in abstract, but for the most part they were all figurative. They were culturally based, and so I felt very much at home. It's almost like going home from spending a day at school and then going home and there's the tortillas and the frijoles waiting for you. It was kind of my going home, and all of a sudden discovering that there was a whole nother world there that hadn't been talked about in those terms in the visual art.
And how did you get involved into the printmaking?
Well, that was always, like I said, always everything that's happened was always been by accident, you might say. Early on, when I was in high school, Mr. Kennedy had exposed us to some screen printing in that area. So I dealt a little bit of screen printing. When I was working for Texas Instruments and then some other companies, some other high-tech companies, we used to do panels for jets that had to be screen printed so that they would install these panels that would either fire missiles or chaff or whatever they call that, anti-missile flares. And so I learned a little bit about, I was exposed to screen printing there. It wasn't until late 80s that I got an opportunity to go to Self-Help Graphics here in Los Angeles. After waiting for about 3 years, I finally, through Gil's assistance, Sister Karen invited me to go. And so I did one print early on, the Pan Dulce print. Then I went again in 91, I think, and did another print, totally different than the Pan Dulce. I guess they were expecting me to do some more, because it was anyway, I went back, and I thought to myself, wouldn't this be something if something like this existed in Texas, in Austin? And so I had just acquired a painting studio of my own, and I had all this this room, and I had my easel set up and everything. But because I was curious about maybe doing some screen printing, uh, I started acquiring the equipment, started printing for some friends, and a friend of mine, Cynthia Perez from Las Manitas, uh, encouraged me to write a grant and maybe present it to the city and to the state, and perhaps I would get some funding that I could use for a project similar to self-help. So with her encouragement, I did, and I got funded. I think it was in 1993 for the first time. And I figured it was just going to be a one-time thing, and it wasn't very much money that I got, but it was enough to print local friends of mine, artists that were Ray Gaitan, and who else? Fidencio Duran, several other artists.
He's a person that really has not been given the credit that he
Who's
deserves.
that?
Ignacio.
Fidencio?
Fidencio Duran.
Oh.
He's from Seguin, right?
No, he's right outside of Austin, not quite Seguin, but somewhere in that area, little town around there. Yeah, he's a very accomplished muralist. He does beautiful work, and I think his landscapes are marvelous.
Yeah.
So they came and did a print, and I said, well, I guess this is going to be it. But
So that was your first project.
that was the first project.
And so what was it? What did it consist of?
Well, it was. I invited the artist. By then, I had acquired enough of this homemade equipment to where I had experimented. I knew it worked, and so then I was going to put it through
What
the
year?
real test. This was in '90. I acquired it in '92. I got the funding for '93, '94. So during that year, I spent inviting these guys to come in, do some printing. So there were 12 of us all together. I included myself. And so that was the first year. I didn't think I was going to get funded again, but I submitted it again, and sure enough, I got funded the second time, because the project really, if you look at it, it's based off the self-help graphics model, where...
Like a print atelier.
Exactly. So everybody benefits from it. The artists benefit, the city, obviously, they...
So the artist came, they did a print, and then what happened to that?
Well, in those days, they would... since Sister Karen was doing it, I decided to do it the same way. The artists would get half their edition, and I would keep the other half. The studio would keep the other half. And it would sort of pay off for them. And I figured, well, I'll eventually sell these. But, over a few years, I amassed a lot of prints. And I really hadn't thought about the business end of art.
Right.
And that's when the whole world of business opened up, and I realized, hey, I've got a lot of product here that I've got to sell. And so all of a sudden, the Serre project took on a new light, the business light, you might say. The business end came to bite me, and I had to really start thinking about marketing. I had to start thinking about doing a business plan, and how I was going to sell these prints as individual prints or as to collectors. So one of the first things that happened was the museum in South Texas in Corpus Christi. The director there, Bill Otten, heard of what I was doing, and he came to visit, and sure enough, he bought, I think in those days it was the first 3 years, by the time we met, first 3 years. And after that, he kept buying every suite every year, and so I felt like that was really great, because it helped me sustain the project. It helped the artists, because they were being collected by a museum that normally wouldn't probably have collected their work, and it gave us some viability, because they would actually have exhibits, and they would put our prints. To this day, they still exhibit our prints on a regular basis. So a lot of these young artists that came through there normally would not have had the opportunity to have been exhibited in these museums, or perhaps even collected by some of the collectors that started purchasing the work. Obviously Gil Cardenas and Dr. Ricardo Romo, and others from around.
So you were in essence a lot of the artists, seems to me. I mean, I don't know the Texas scene, but it seems like everywhere they it's a new technique. It's a whole new. They had to. You had to teach them the rudiments of graphic art for them because there are many artists that hadn't done prints editions.
Exactly.
So
They
you
are
became their mentor. You
right.
became their teacher.
In a sense,
Yeah.
yeah. It all revolved around self-help's model, but I felt a need. I mean, the model was there because there was a need for it to exist. In self-help's case, I mean, a lot of young artists have made their name just by going through their doors, creating prints, etc. And I wanted to have something similar to that. And so it started on its own energy. It grew faster and larger than I ever thought it would be. But there was a need for it, just like those exhibits in Houston where people would come out to see the Latino, the Mexican American, the Chicano artwork on the walls. They were hungry for it. The same thing with artists. They needed a place to go create art that they could perhaps help to sustain them for a while. And what better way than to create a print? They would come back. They would go back home with 25 prints that they could sell for whatever they wanted to.
And what was the process? Did they work together? Did they each
well,
have a studio? How was the interaction? What was the production like?
Well, I got to learn a lot about artists. I got to learn a lot about printmaking. I got to learn a lot about marketing. I realized that some artists don't want to sell their work for the amount of money that I was selling back in those days. I mean, still it's not a lot, but some of them would be very hesitant, or if they came, the more established artists would want to sell their work for more, which I understand, but they also, I felt that it was, for the more established artists, it was a time for them to possibly give back to where their work would also be affordable by the general public, preferably within the community that was at. And the younger artists had no problem with that. Obviously, they were thrilled to come in and do prints and learn something new. 99% of the artists that were coming through our doors were generally from Texas at that time and had never never done a screen print. Most of them had studied printmaking in schools, but screen printing was not the thing to do.
What is it? What's the difference? What's a screen print as opposed to block?
Well, screen print is probably one of the printmaking mediums that has come on since the 1940s. I think it's really evolved. I think the technique is just a stenciling technique, where you can actually, if you take a piece of paper, you cut out a hole, you put it on another piece of paper, and you paint over that hole. You lift up the paper, and you have a perfect reproduction of the round circle that you cut out. That's the same thing basically with screen printing. It's more of a blue collar printmaking because there's a medium, because a lot of it's used for a lot of industrial functions. A lot of stoves, clocks, you name it, the faces are screen printed. Of course, now it's evolved a little bit more. T-shirts, obviously, is another one. But it's more of a blue-collar printmaking. It's not a flashy, it's not intaglio, it's not lithography, it's not woodblock. Some of those have been around for many, many years and has been used. Screen printing has evolved, I think, since the early 50s and 60s. That's when Andy Warhol made it pretty popular and accepted as a fine art medium. And so, being Latino, being Chicano, I think it has its roots back in the Chicano movement, civil rights movement, where it was very easy to go into someone's garage, set up a screen print situation, print out some posters, and you're off to the demonstration the next day.
I remember in San Francisco, one of the really interesting was at the Galeria La Raza, they started doing these yearly calendars based on the lithograph calendars, but they had artists design, like one year the theme would be food, and 12 artists would do 1 month with a silk screen, mainly there were silk screens because that was a technique that they used there, or lithography, but editions of based on like a calendar and so on. So these were editions that people came. Was there? What about the market? Was there an attempt to build a market, or there were very few galleries, at that time. There still are. More and
Yeah.
more now, I think there's a possibility of selling. Now people identify themselves as collectors. At that time, people didn't, and the artists really had to struggle. I mean, they
Yeah.
still do, but
Well, a lot of them would have to, unless they had been around, unless they, it's one of the keys, I think, to being a business person as opposed to being an artist. Uh, when I graduated from school, and most folks in my generation that would finish school were never taught the basics of business. They were just thrown out and say, "Here, you're an artist. Here's your diploma. See you later." You get out there and you realize that there's a whole world of business to be dealt with. You got to find your consumer. You got to buy supplies. So you got to write a business plan. You got to present it to a bank. You got to have all these things. In terms of market, and early on, probably very, very few folks were buying Chicano art, except for folks that had a vision or realized the importance. And Bill Otten being one, and it's a museum in South Texas, and of course within uh, our own society of Chicano artists, I think you might say, we had little windows of opportunities and areas of opportunities through collectors that started collecting. Depending on the area that you were located, you could find a lawyer or a businessman that would perhaps have the money to purchase. That would not necessarily want, beautiful flowers and,
so what was when you talk about beautiful flowers? You seem to imply that that wasn't what the artists were depicting. Those that made
very few did.
what was the general of the ateliers that you were involved with? What was the subject matter of the prints that
Well,
came out?
you know, it was never that I gave anybody a theme to work with. So I never gave them parameters. I just told them, come in and do a print. This is an opportunity, it's a Latino-based uh, organization, print shop, that you can come in and do whatever you want. So I never gave them a theme or parameters to work with. They just came in and did their work. Majority of them, I'm not saying that some of them didn't do, uh, I guess, flowers or anything, because there are some artists that do. Uh, Most of them would do things related to the culture. Uh, the ones that did do the more decorative things, what I call decorative, had this sort of um, Diego Rivera mass to them. This feel like Diego Rivera's flowers. Um, so there was this cultural thing that would come out in their work, regardless of what they were doing, whether it was cars, whether it was flowers, whether it was skeletons, whatever. Something would come out that would put the brand of Chicano, Latino, whatever, on it.
Could you amplify a little bit more of that? The content, the subject matter was one thing. What about coloration or any other stylistic things that you think were
Very, very
specific?
colorful. I mean, early on, you could sense and you could see, visualize the color, the way Latinos in general approach color, and it's just something inherent. Now you see more of that happening simply because of the digital world that's out there. It's so easy to saturate color or use color in a saturated fashion. Uh, but early on, I would notice that there was this inherence to a very massive and very bold color that was used by Latinos, regardless of whether their subject matter was Latino oriented or not. You could sense that it was. So that was one of the characteristics that I've seen. Now it's evolved. It's a little more, you might say, sophisticated. Uh, Things are changing. Everything. The digital world has been very influential in how our younger Latinos see their work and see their place within the overall scope of things. But early on, you could sense that color and that massiveness and the of volume and that was used by Latinos.
So, if you look back, how many, like ateliers would you have, or has there been periods, and how has that shifted and changed from the 1992 to the 2010? I mean, just general impressions
Well,
of
the
your own.
imagery has pretty much stayed the same.
Uh,
It may have become more refined, but I do notice that more artists come to me now with digital files that they've created. More artists are more digitally oriented. There are more artists now dealing with the digital image where they produce something on the computer and it's intended to be digitally produced and then eventually uh, outputted that way. So there's no real hands-on. Traditional tools do not play a big part of it, and that's I think that's valid. Uh, so there is a shift in that, and along with that shift, I think uh, there has not been as much of a shift in imagery as I thought there would be by now.
let's. What about gender? Did women start coming, or have there been any women that have come to the ateliers and?
Oh yeah, yeah. There's been, I we try to get at least 50-50 most of the year, but most of the time, for every year that we print. But sometimes it's harder to invite uh, Latino artists than there are Latinos. But that's changing now. I noticed that. I mean, all along there's always been a large sector of Latino artists being produced by Latinas. It's just not. It has not been as prevalently exhibited, let's say, as Latinos. Now that's changing. I think more. Alma Lopez, of course, Judy Baca, and Carmen Lomas Garza. All these folks, these ladies, have been coming into prominence, and the younger ladies, Fabiana, I forget her last name right now, but they're all. They're all the new generation of Latinas and are more outspoken, and I think they have a lot of energy that I think is going to be very, very important in the future for us.
What about the talleres de gráfica? You've been part of this. It's sort of like a movement within a movement.
Hmm.
How did you get involved with them, and how have you seen it progress? You know, the talleres, themselves,
Um,
because every time that Gil, I know, has been very instrumental in sort of like getting the groups together,
right,
exchange, and
right.
so could you talk a little bit about the development of the talleres, or the idea of a taller, and what it means to you personally, and what you would like to see within that?
Well, I think the individually back in when, as far as I can remember, when I started doing art, I would hear of artists. I would hear artists that were located in various parts of the United States, Latin America, etc. And I would see how things would happen in Los Angeles, in New York, in Florida, in Chicago, and Texas, but there was this component missing that would bring everybody together. I guess with communication being as free and as available as it is now, and with folks like Gil Cardenas and Dr. Romo and Chon Noriega and all these other folks that have played a major part in bringing artists together. Sister Karen, obviously, from Self Help Graphics. And I mean, there are many, many more people, but all of a sudden they're all coming together and they seem to be gelling into this whole idea of talleres and how I feel a group of artists is a lot stronger than just individual artists. And I think that through the necessity or through the need, I think has brought us all together.
In your particular taller, uh, could you? I just for my information, structurally, people come and spend a period of time,
About a week.
a week in Austin,
Hmm.
at working, and how
Hmm.
many do they work together, or do they?
Oh, just one artist per week.
One artist per week.
Every now and then we might have two if we can afford it, the time and everything, but generally one artist per week will come and they'll spend the whole place to themselves. And by the end of that week, they usually come out. Very few don't finish, and the few that don't usually come back the following week to finish up. But it's sort of a crash course in screen printing and in analyzing your work, so it's very informative to them, and it's also a challenge to create something in 1 week that they're not usually used to. So it is a challenge for them, but it's an important one.
And in terms of I would like maybe just some personal reflections, in terms of your your involvement, your publishing enterprise, how it's how it came to be and where it's going, and what do you hope what's the next step for you?
Well, it all came together just by sheer accident, but like I said, the door opens, you got to go through it. And what I've been able to do is amass a lot of prints that I hope will be part of our legacy, our history. And where it's going to go, I'm hoping that more and more people are aware of what we're doing as Latinos here in the United States, and that we are part of that artistic fabric that binds everybody together here. And we have a voice, we have to say, and I think it's being heard more and more, and that's where our future is. More folks, more people learn about it, and not just in the United States, but all over the world. I think the more folks hear about it, the more success we'll find, because we are unique in the way we approach artwork.
Any other final?
No, it's a pleasure meeting you. It's been something that I've been looking forward to many, many years.
Okay, well, we're beginning to know each other now that we're in Texas.
That's right.